In theaters in 1960, audience members reacted in terror as they watched Alfred Hitchcock's newest film, Psycho, gasping as every single cinematic rule was broken. By directly challenging Hollywood's film standards, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho revolutionized the American film industry. Psycho reformed movie theater operations, altered the landscape of the horror genre, and contributed to the creation of the age rating system.
Alfred Hitchcock was born in London on August 13, 1899. After attending technical school, he began his career in advertisement, which would later help him build an identifiable brand as a major director. Hitchcock entered the London film industry in 1921. He began as a title card designer. 4 years later, he directed his first film. 23 films later, in 1939, Hitchcock moved to Hollywood.
He was interested in the fact that the Hollywood film industry had a better infrastructure than the British film industry, which was well suited, but he wanted to go bigger and do more complex stuff, have more resources, and Hollywood offered him that opportunity.
At the time, Hollywood was still recovering from a series of scandals. Both to foster goodwill with the public and to avoid government intervention, Hollywood had implemented a series of regulations known as the Hays Code in 1927. The Hays Code stated that no picture should lower the moral standards of those who see it. To uphold this ideal, unsuitable subjects were censored. Although the code succeeded in enforcing its moral guidelines, it handicapped creativity. Because filmmakers could not show morally complex situations, movies often avoided controversial topics like corruption, injustice, and social struggles. By the late 1950s, many audiences felt these restrictions made films feel unrealistic compared to the changing world.
In 1959, Hitchcock began brainstorming again. He abandoned his previous film, No Bail for the Judge, after encountering problems caused by Audrey Hepburn's pregnancy and issues with censorship. For his next film, Hitchcock wanted to create something innovative that played to audiences' interests. Inspired by the success of recent cheap horror films like Frankenstein and Dracula, Hitchcock decided to put his own twist on the genre. He purchased the rights to a book about a murderer with a personality disorder, Robert Bloch's Psycho.
In Psycho, Marion Crane stays overnight at the secluded Bates Motel. There she meets Norman Bates, the motel owner and caretaker of his sickly mother, Mrs. Bates. Later that night, Marion is brutally stabbed to death by a female figure. Marion's disappearance is investigated by her sister and boyfriend, who discover the corpse of Mrs. Bates in the basement. In a shocking twist, Norman has a split personality disorder, and he believes himself to be Mrs. Bates. His Mrs. Bates persona is the killer.
Because of the violent content, Hitchcock faced his first major issue. Paramount, his production company, refused to finance the movie and show it in theaters unless Hitchcock financed the film himself, which he agreed to. That was all based on the assumption that it would pass the Hays Code, which was another problem because he was attempting to create a horror film when showing gore on screen was forbidden. In an interview, Hitchcock explained,
"I believe in putting the horror in the mind of the audience and not necessarily on the screen."
Rather than directly showing it, he implied violence. Even in his infamous shower scene, the audience only saw clips of Marion screaming and a figure with a knife. Because there was no gore on screen, the censors for the Hays Code reluctantly approved the film.
Hitchcock managed to make Psycho so terrifying that audience members across the U.S. fainted. Many women wrote to Janet Leigh, the actress who played Marion Crane, to tell her that they refused to shower after watching Psycho. To build this level of fear, Hitchcock relied on suspense. However, suspense did not work well in movie theaters in that day. Before Psycho, theaters would run movies on a loop. Moviegoers arrived during the film and then watched the beginning segments they missed after the end. This forced movie plots to be episodic rather than having an overarching story. Psycho was not like this. The impact of Marion's death and the final plot twist would be ruined if the film was not watched from start to finish.
Hitchcock's solution was to have all movie theaters set start times for Psycho, which Paramount allowed because he financed the film himself. After the film began, audience members would be locked into the room and latecomers would be locked out. There may very well have been aesthetic grounds for this, but its promotional worth was greater still. The decision generated enormous publicity. Psycho became the second highest grossing film of 1960, in part because audiences wanted to experience this new way of running theaters. Psycho's popularity encouraged all movie theaters to follow Hitchcock's model, revolutionizing the experience of watching a film.
With scheduled start times, audiences witnessed movies together as a community rather than as isolated individuals. The audience's experience as a whole was a new facet for directors to manipulate. Hitchcock told French filmmaker François Truffaut that he wanted to use the cinematic art to achieve something of mass emotion. As plots evolved to be more novel-like, the film industry prioritized movies that utilized complex plot points. Psycho's influence normalized the assumption that all audience members have the same knowledge at the same time, which allowed these developments. Modern cinematic narratives and plot structures are built on this foundational concept.
Psycho fostered the idea that unthinkable violence could happen to anyone, which horrified and fascinated audiences. Its broadest contribution to horror was challenging traditional narrative structures.
By not letting us meet Norman until 35 minutes into the movie, Hitchcock gave us Marion as the point of identification, and then he takes her away. You and I as audiences, we have been building this point of identification. Nobody had taken a major character that we think is what the movie is about away from us before the half point of the movie. People were going nuts.
Killing off the main character halfway through the film shocked audience members. By removing narrative safety, Psycho altered viewers' expectations.
Psycho was the first movie to be described as a, quote, as a roller coaster, sort of compared to the experience of the roller coaster in terms of the swinging emotions and the thrill.
Psycho's success encouraged directors to shift from supernatural predictable films to films with a shock factor and reflections of realism. Beyond its contributions to the art of creating horror films, Psycho reframed the horror industry. Horror, which had been viewed as cheap and mediocre, could be serious and artistically significant to cinema and American culture, influencing the creation of later artistic horror movies such as The Shining and Silence of the Lambs. The thematic elements of Psycho showed how horror could be used to discuss serious topics like psychology. Psycho confirmed that horror could be worthy of academic discussion and critical analysis.
Psycho's success revealed that audiences were excited by films that explored challenging topics. In Psycho, Hitchcock pushed the boundaries of the Hays Code, showing audiences graphic violence, Marion Crane in a bra and slip, and a flushing toilet for the first time. It also defied expectations by killing off the apparent main character. In segments like the shower scene, Hitchcock and his wife went through frame by frame to ensure the audience never saw Marion's naked body or the knife hitting her. This created the illusion of violence.
Hitchcock followed the Hays Code while tricking the audience into thinking he hadn't. The general public and critics alike loved it. A newspaper reported that all I could hear as I walked out of the theater were words of praise and admiration for this fine film. Psycho was deemed a skillfully done horror masterpiece. However, when Psycho was first released, some critics were uncertain how to react. In an early review, New York Times' Bosley Crowther warned audiences that they would need a pretty strong stomach for Hitchcock's blood curdler. Yet as the film's impact became clearer, opinion shifted. Crowther later defended the film against calls for censorship.
The overall positive reaction proved Americans wanted to see films that defied traditional norms. The Hays Code stood for the opposite. It censored dauntless ideas to enforce a moral code that audiences no longer craved. Psycho's praise reflected a broader societal shift towards challenging traditions. Throughout the 1960s, Americans participated in major reform movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, which exposed harsh realities about inequality, bias, and brutality. As Americans watched protest marches and political conflicts unfold on television, they became more open to the discussion of previously taboo topics and wanted films to address violence and injustice. Movies like Psycho reflected this growing willingness to confront uncomfortable realities.
The Hays Code forced movies to follow an outdated philosophy from a time period that audiences no longer identified with. Instead of being told what they were allowed to see, Americans wanted the opportunity to choose. However, not everyone agreed the code should disappear. Some critics argue that removing censorship would lead to excessive violence and immoral content in films. Psycho was a component within a much larger narrative of transforming values. It forced Hollywood to acknowledge that Americans wanted the film industry to mirror their current society instead of past ideals.
Hitchcock exposed that Americans wanted to see films based on darker ideas, and he created a blueprint for content that technically passed the Hays Code. The code was abolished less than a decade after Psycho's release in 1968. It was replaced with the MPAA rating system, where audiences could choose whether a film was suitable specifically for them, instead of only having options that had been deemed suitable for everyone.
In creating Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock took one of the most important risks in film history. Psycho radically altered components of the horror genre by having ordinary people in a seemingly ordinary place become victims to indiscriminate brutality. Creating fear in the mind of the viewer and on screen redefined and mainstream psychological horror. Psycho's usage of graphic violence normalized the addition of gore into films. Additionally, elements from Psycho such as a killer with a knife, suspense, and picking off isolated victims evolved into the foundations of the slasher genre, which later included movies such as Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Psycho shaped the slasher genre beyond abstraction, and Hitchcock created a horror that was deeper than pure violence, which altered the societal outlook on fright films.
Making Psycho was vital to the development of the modern film industry, and it sent ripples through every aspect of cinema. Psycho revolutionized movie theaters through set showing times, caused audience reactions that influenced the abolition of the Hays Code, and reformed the horror genre by proving it could be artistically respectable. Psycho permanently transformed the way movies are experienced, showing how innovation can alter the boundaries of art.